Honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to add my voice to the rising opposition to this bill C-10, which perhaps is best characterized as the Conservatives' most recent piece of dumb-on-crime legislation. Mr. Speaker, our understanding of crime and the appropriate way to handle those who transgress the rules of our society has evolved over the past 400 years. We've moved from a time when criminality was commonly associated with witchcraft to a society that far better understands the root causes of crime and better ways to handle criminals. And I am truly dismayed to see our government completely ignore the work being done on these important topics. They seem to be taking us back to the Middle Ages. And, Mr. Speaker, that's not just empty rhetoric. Why do I say they're taking us back to the Middle Ages? Well, first of all, it's obvious that they care not a whit about policies to fight the ultimate cause of crime. Second, they don't care about deterrence. If they did, they would have paid attention to a recent study by their own Department of Justice that was released a week or so ago, which provided evidence that longer sentences are not an effective deterrent to crime. And indeed, the results from that study are consistent with international evidence on the topic. So if they don't care about fighting the ultimate cause of crime, if they don't care about deterrent, what's left? The only thing they care about is the principle of retribution or vengeance. And that is why I make the statement that they are taking us back to the Middle Ages. Or
in French, what we can say is that the principle of fighting against the ultimate causes of crime, this is not at all important to the Conservatives, and at the same time, for the reasons that I've just expressed, the principle of deterrence is not important to the Conservatives. All that is important is the principle of vengeance or retribution, and that is in this direction that the bill is a return to the Middle Ages.
Would deny that protecting the citizens of Canada from harm is the most important objective of government. In fact, the government is granted a monopoly on the use of force for just that purpose. But with that power comes the responsibility to act in an appropriate manner that benefits society. Our country was founded on the principles of peace, order, and good government. And, Mr. Speaker, good government means examining all the facts, all the opinions. It means talking to experts and making public policy decisions that are based on evidence, not knee-jerk ideological desires. Good government also means respecting Parliament's role in public policy debates. My opposition to this bill stems from its ineffective and ideological nature and from this government's inability or unwillingness to work with Parliament on this major issue of public policy. I can already hear that familiar refrain from the other side, soft on crime, soft on victims' rights. Victims' rights and crime are very important, and I find the constant use of victims as a shield for this ideologically driven agenda to be offensive. I believe nobody in this House is opposed to supporting victims of crime. To suggest otherwise is simply insulting to the intelligence of Canadians. And indeed, I might mention the case earlier today, my colleague, the member for Mount Royal, when he has presented amendments that would strengthen the provision in this bill to support victims of terrorism and add to the remedies that they have against those who committed terrorism. It seems the government is not going to accept that amendment, but that's a concrete example of Liberals supporting remedies for those who are victims of crime or victims of terrorism. But I think, what does it mean to support victims of crime? It must certainly mean doing our best to ensure that crime doesn't happen in the first place, or that those who break our laws should be treated in a way that will minimize recidivism. That's how we stand up for victims, by working to ensure that we reduce crime as much as possible. and also through measures such as proposed by my colleague from Mount Royal. I've spoken about the conservative crime agenda in general, but I also want to spend some time on this bill in particular. My primary concern with this bill, Mr. Speaker, is that it's fundamentally ineffective. According to Statistics Canada, crime is going down, both in volume and severity. This should be trumpeted as a success, Mr. Speaker. Crime is going down. Isn't that our objective? When the government should be standing up and saying, the evidence is saying our policies work. They instead say that they don't believe the statistics. They claim the numbers don't matter. But they do matter, Mr. Speaker. So here, for the benefit of my colleagues on the other side of this place, I will go over a few of the facts that they choose to ignore. As I said before, crime is down. Locking people up for longer doesn't necessarily make them less likely to reoffend. As I said just a few minutes ago, that is confirmed by a very recent study by the Department of Justice that was acquired through access to information. When we are dealing with young offenders, the negative effects of prison are only multiplied. What the government needs to understand is that this is not just liberal nonsense or lefty soft on crime rhetoric. Look at our neighbors to the south. The U.S. incarceration rate is 700% higher than ours. 700%, Mr. Speaker. They very nearly reached a point where fully 1% of the U.S. population was in prison. And what did that mean for the U.S.? They continue to have higher crime rates than we do. They continue to spend billions more on prisons than we do. Some states, such as California, actually spend more on prisons than they spend on schools. Prisons are not the perfect solution to crime, Mr. Speaker. That is simply outdated 18th century thought and nothing more. For many criminals, prisons have not proven the palaces of reform that the Conservatives promise they will be. For many, it is simply a school for crime. Our prison system is already at its limit. This plan to dump thousands of new offenders into the system will simply break it. Low-level offenders will enter the system after convictions for petty crimes, and they will leave having made new criminal connections and having learned the skills of the trade. That should never be the outcome of our justice system. And despite all of this tough talk, one of the things you won't hear the Conservatives talking about during this debate is the mental health of our prisoners. It's widely understood by those who study crime that mental health issues are one of the biggest driving factors of criminal behavior. Taking care of the mentally ill among us has been a failure of all levels of government for decades now. As of 2007, 12% of the federal male prison population had a diagnosed mental illness. That's a 71% increase over 1997. And those figures are even worse for female inmates. Our prisons are not supposed to be substitute mental hospitals, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I struggle to find a worse place for a mentally ill person. Currently, Aboriginals are incarcerated at a rate 9 times that of non-Aboriginal people, and that, I believe, is simply unacceptable. Like most prisoners, they are in prison for nonviolent property or drug offenses. Time and time again, we've seen that the solution to this vicious cycle is not more prisons. Mr. Speaker, I've covered some of the negative social costs of this dumb on crime agenda, but it's also important to talk about the fiscal costs. As you know, the opposition has been asking the government for detailed cost estimates for their crime agenda. We've received nothing from the government except empty rhetoric. This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Parliamentarians are both policymakers and the ultimate keepers of the public purse. We have a right to know the costs of the legislation that we are asked to support. And there's another consideration, and I will borrow a term from American politics, unfunded mandate. Yes, there will be significant federal costs, but we can't ignore the impact these changes will have on provincial governments. These legislative changes, taken in concert with previous changes, will lead to many new provincial inmates, a cost borne solely by the provinces. So this government has shown little respect for Parliament and its role, and it is also showing very little respect for provincial governments and their budgets. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Alfred Perrin. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for having shared his thoughts with us on the Conservative government's bill that they are presenting to amend the criminal code. I'd like to add my colleague, because we heard a bit earlier, according to my colleague across the way, on legislation and the marijuana plants. It was said that 6 plants could be the equivalent of hundreds of joints, and therefore that could be major smuggling. And so when when they sell to others, usually it's in bulk. So, I mean, I'd like to know what he thinks about that part of the legislation. In his opinion, is it logical to consider that 6 plants would be the equivalent of that kind of an offense?
Merci, Mag.
I thank my colleague for her question. And I'd make 2 points. First of all, in theory, there's the principle, rather, of mandatory minimums, and it's scattered throughout this bill because people think that some people think, like as I do, that the judge should have the discretion. But this mandatory minimum really can have, indeed, the opposite effect as that intended. So we oppose that principle in the case that she mentions, but also in general. In my opinion, 6 marijuana plants is not a huge amount. But in more general terms, as I said, we oppose mandatory minimums in general. Thank you.
My comment there. The honourable member for Fort McMurray, Athabasca.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I listened to my friend across the way intently. I am a part of the Justice Committee, and I want him to know that I am interested in what he has to say. But for the most part, he's talking about costs to implement the bill. And I'm wondering if he has had the opportunity to speak to victims and to ascertain the costs if this bill is not imposed, if we continue to have the high amounts of violent crimes in this country, if we continue to have loss of property through damage committed by youth, if we continue to have psychological damage to individuals for treatment. And Mr. Speaker, the cost to society as a whole when some crime gets out of control, has he looked at those costs, the real costs that victims are concerned with? They're not concerned with the cost of implementing this bill. The only time they're concerned with that cost, Mr. Speaker, is when they aren't actually affected by any crime. And Mr. Speaker, we've heard from Canadians. They're impacted by crime, they want it to stop, and they want this bill and these laws to go forward.
Principal member for Markham Unionville.
Mr. Speaker, I don't accept this principle that the Conservatives have a monopoly about caring about victims. Our view is that this bill will create more victims, because when you send young people into jail, they learn to become criminals. They go out, they're more likely to reoffend. The Department of Justice has itself said that longer sentences don't deter crime. So the best way to help victims is to reduce crime. And the central point of my remarks is that this law will not reduce crime. It is more likely to increase crime, and that cannot be good for victims. And finally, my colleague from Mount Royal has proposed amendments to this legislation which would strengthen the provisions that would help victims from terrorism. So if the government cares about victims, I hope they will accept the amendments proposed by the member from Mount Royal.
Hear, hear. We have time for one short question. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for La Salle-et-Mar. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask my colleague from Markham Unionville to talk to us a little bit about the situation in the province of Ontario in terms of crime, because we have heard from government members about what's happened in their ridings. They testified as to what they heard from various Canadians. But I'd like to hear what he's heard in Markham Unionville and also from Ontarians in general.
Merci,
I thank my colleague for that excellent question. I'm very lucky in the sense that Markham is a part of the region of York in Ontario, and we have a crime rate that is one of the lowest in all of Canada. The police are very effective, and this is a very multicultural community that I have in my riding. The chief of police has many connections with the various cultural communities, and therefore I believe that it's a system that works very well now. Certainly in my riding, we don't need this bill.
Before we resume debate, I'll need to tell the honourable member for Fort McMurray Athabasca that I'll need to interrupt him in about 7 minutes into his speech. This is for, of course, statements by members. The honourable